Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe. Your support is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. Nicolas Cage was known for his eclectic taste in roles and an equally eclectic taste in real estate. When he purchased the LaLaurie Mansion in New Orleans, many thought it was just another example of his eccentric personality. The mansion, infamous for its dark history of torture and death, seemed an unlikely home for anyone, even a Hollywood star. However, Cage was fascinated by the lore surrounding the house and believed it would be an intriguing place to live. The mansion stood grand and ominous in the heart of the French Quarter, its wrought-iron balconies and imposing facade casting long shadows on the narrow street. Cage moved in with excitement, eager to explore every corner of his new home. Despite its grim past, he hoped to find a sense of inspiration within its walls. From the first night, however, it became clear that the mansion held more than just historical intrigue. Cage reported hearing strange noises, footsteps echoing through empty hallways, whispers in the dead of night, and the unmistakable sound of crying coming from the upper floors. He initially dismissed these occurrences as the creaks and groans of an old house settling, but the phenomena only intensified. One night, Cage invited a few friends over for dinner. As they sat around the long dining table, the conversation inevitably turned to the mansion's dark history. Suddenly, the room grew cold, and the candles flickered as if a draft had swept through the room. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, and Cage tried to lighten the mood with a joke, but the tension was palpable. As they continued to talk, one of the guests, a woman named Maria, felt a sudden chill on her neck. She reached up to touch it and gasped. "It's freezing," she said, her voice trembling. The others gathered around, and sure enough, the air around her was icy cold. Cage suggested they move to another room, but as they stood up, a loud bang echoed through the house, followed by the sound of shattering glass. They rushed to the source of the noise, a guest bedroom on the second floor. The window had been shattered from the inside, but there was no sign of an intruder. The curtains fluttered in the breeze, and a sense of foreboding filled the room. Cage felt a chill run down his spine. "Maybe we should call it a night," he suggested, trying to keep his voice steady. That night, after his friends had left, Cage lay in bed, unable to sleep. His mind raced with thoughts of the mansion's past and the strange occurrences that had plagued his stay. As he drifted into an uneasy sleep, he was jolted awake by a loud crash from the hallway. He grabbed a flashlight and cautiously stepped out of his room. The hallway was dark and silent, but as he made his way down the stairs, the temperature dropped sharply. His breath formed visible puffs of air, and a sense of dread settled over him. He reached the bottom of the stairs and saw that the large mirror in the floor had shattered, pieces of glass scattered across the floor. As he bent down to pick up the shards, he felt a presence behind him. He turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, and he quickly retreated to his room, locking the door behind him. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night, his mind racing with thoughts of what could be causing these disturbances. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Cage contacted a local paranormal investigator named Marcus. Marcus had a reputation for uncovering the truth behind haunted locations, and Cage hoped he could shed some light on the strange events in the mansion. Marcus arrived the next day, equipped with cameras, audio recorders, and various other tools of his trade. He conducted a thorough investigation, interviewing Cage, and examining every room in the house. As night fell, they set up their equipment and prepared for a long night of observation. The first few hours were uneventful, but around midnight the temperature in the house dropped suddenly. The cameras picked up strange orbs of light floating through the hallways, and the audio recorders captured faint whispers and cries. Cage and Marcus watched the monitors intently, their anticipation growing with each passing minute. Suddenly, one of the cameras in the basement went dark. They rushed downstairs to investigate, and as they entered the room, they were hit by a wave of cold air. The camera lay on the floor, its tripod knocked over. The sense of dread was almost palpable, and Cage felt a knot tighten in his stomach. As they examined the camera, they heard a loud bang from the corner of the room. They turned to see a shadowy figure standing in the darkness, its form barely visible in the dim light. Marcus raised his flashlight, and the beam revealed a woman in old-fashioned clothing, her eyes wide with fear and sorrow. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Cage and Marcus in stunned silence. They quickly reviewed the footage and found that the camera had captured the apparition. The image was grainy and indistinct, but it was enough to confirm that something supernatural was indeed occurring in the mansion. Determined to understand what was happening, Marcus delved into the history of the LaLaurie Mansion. The mansion had been the site of numerous atrocities, and many believed that the spirits of those who had suffered there still haunted its halls. Marcus concluded that the presence in the house was likely the spirit of one of LaLaurie's victims, trapped and tormented by the lingering energy of the mansion's dark past. He suggested a cleansing ritual to help release the spirits and bring peace to the house. With Marcus's guidance, Cage agreed to the ritual. They gathered in the foyer, where the shattered mirrors still lay, and began the process. Marcus recited prayers and burned sage, the smoke curling through the air and filling the house with a pungent scent. The atmosphere grew tense, and the sense of being watched intensified. As the ritual continued, the temperature dropped again, and the shadows seemed to come alive. The air crackled with energy, and a low, mournful wail echoed through the house. The ritual reached its climax, and Marcus commanded the spirits to leave, to find peace and move on. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting. The temperature returned to normal, and the sense of dread dissipated. Cage and Marcus stood in the quiet, the house feeling lighter and more at peace than it had since Cage had moved in. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences ceased, and the mansion seemed to settle into a more tranquil state. Cage continued to live there for a time, but the experience had left a lasting impression on him. He eventually sold the house, unable to fully shake the memories of the haunting. The LaLaurie Mansion remains a place of fascination and fear, its dark history and supernatural occurrences continuing to captivate those who hear its story. For Nicolas Cage, it was a lesson in the power of the past and the mysteries that linger just beyond our understanding. I've always loved hiking. There's something about being out in the wilderness, surrounded by nothing but trees and mountains, that makes you feel alive. It's a chance to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life, to clear your head and just breathe. I've hiked all over the country, from the Appalachian Trail to the Pacific Crest, but there's one trip that I'll never forget, one that's changed the way I see the wilderness forever. It was late summer, and I decided to take a solo trip to the White Mountains in New Hampshire. I'd been there a few times before, but this time I wanted to explore a more remote area, one that wasn't as well-traveled. I'd heard about a trail that led to a series of old logging camps, long abandoned and forgotten by time. The idea of discovering something hidden something that few others had seen, was attempting to resist. I set out early in the morning, the sun just beginning to rise over the mountains. The trailhead was empty, the parking lot devoid of any other cars. It was perfect, just me and the wilderness. I packed my gear, checked my map, and started up the trail. The first few miles were easy, the path well marked and clear. The air was crisp, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. I made good time, reaching the first of the old camps by mid-morning. Attention scratched into the wood, barely legible, with the words "Stay away." My first instinct was to turn and run, but something drew me closer. I had to see what was inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the silent forest. The inside was dark, the air thick with the smell of rot and decay. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. The cabin was empty, just a single room with a broken bed and a rusted stove. But there was something else, something scratched into the walls, just like the sign outside, "Lost, can't escape." They're watching. The words were scrawled everywhere, and the same frantic handwriting. My heart raced as I read them, a sense of dread settling over me. Whoever had written those words had been trapped here, just like I was, and they hadn't made it out. I backed out of the cabin, my mind racing. I had to get out of there, had to find a way back to the trail. But as I turned to leave, I saw them figures standing in the trees, their faces hidden in shadow. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched as I ran. I didn't stop running until I was far from the cabin, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that they were still out there, watching, waiting. By the time I collapsed, I was completely spent. The sun was setting, the forest growing dark once again. I knew I couldn't go on much longer, that if I didn't find my way out soon, I never would. I lay there, staring up at the darkening sky, trying to hold on to the last shred of hope I had left. And then I heard a voice, faint but unmistakable, calling my name. I sat up, my heart pounding. The voice came again, closer this time. I scrambled to my feet, following the sound through the trees. It led me to a small stream, the water glinting in the fading light. On the other side was a figure, waving me over. I didn't stop to think, just splashed through the water and ran toward them. As I got closer, I realized it was a woman, her clothes tattered and dirty, her face gaunt and pale. She grabbed my arm, her grip strong despite her frail appearance. "You have to leave," she whispered, her voice urgent. "They'll come for you just like they came for me." I didn't ask who she meant, didn't ask where she had come from. I just nodded, too terrified to do anything else. She led me through the forest, moving quickly and silently, as if she knew the way by heart. The trees seemed to part for her, the undergrowth less thick, the path clearer. I followed her, too scared to look back. After what felt like hours, we broke through the trees and into a clearing. Ahead of us was the trailhead, the parking lot just visible through the trees. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by fear as I turned to thank the woman only to find that she was gone. I was alone in the clearing, the forest silent once more. I didn't waste any time. I ran to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I didn't look back as I sped down the road, the forest fading into the distance. It wasn't until I was miles away that I finally allowed myself to breathe, the tension slowly leaving my body. I never went back to the White Mountains after that. I still hike, still explore the wilderness, but I'm more careful now. I stay on the well-marked trails, never venturing too far from civilization, and I always keep an eye on the trees, just in case, because I know that out there, in the depths of the forest, something is watching, waiting for its next victim. And I know that I was lucky to escape with my life. The camp was nothing more than a few crumbling foundations and rusted tools, remnants of a time long past. But there was something about it that felt off. The forest was quiet, too quiet, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my imagination, and continued on dot as I ventured deeper into the forest. The trail began to fade, the path growing narrower and more overgrown. The trees closed in around me, their branches casting long shadows on the ground. I kept checking my map, making sure I was still on the right track, but something didn't feel right. The landmarks weren't matching up, and the trail seemed to be leading me in circles. By the time I realized I was lost, it was already late afternoon. The sun was dipping below the mountains, casting the forest in a dim, eerie light. Panic started to set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had my gear, my map, and my compass. I could find my way back. I just needed to retrace my steps, find the trail again. But no matter which way I went, the forest seemed to shift around me. Trees that I swore I'd passed before now loomed in front of me, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The trail was gone, swallowed up by the dense undergrowth. I was completely and utterly lost. As night fell, the temperature dropped, the warm summer air giving way to a biting chill. I found a small clearing and set up camp, building a fire to keep the darkness at bay. But the flames did little to dispel the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The forest was alive with sounds, the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, the distant howl of something that wasn't quite a wolf. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, just the normal sounds of the wilderness. But deep down I knew something was wrong. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something moving in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the firelight. It wasn't just an animal, it was something bigger, something that seemed to be watching me, waiting. I kept the fire going, clutching my knife as if it would do any good against whatever was out there. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted but relieved. I packed up my camp and set out again, determined to find my way back. But the forest had other plans. The trees seemed to shift and change, the landscape twisting in ways that didn't make sense. My map was useless, my compass spinning wildly as if it had lost its bearings. I was trapped in a labyrinth of trees, with no way out. The days blurred together, each one a repetition of the last. I'd walk for hours, only to end up back where I started. My supplies were running low, the food and water dwindling with each passing day. The forest seemed to be closing in on me, the trees growing thicker, the undergrowth more tangled. I started to see things, shadows, flitting between the trees, figures lurking just out of sight. I knew it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the result of exhaustion and fear, but it didn't make it any less terrifying. On the fifth day, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. In a small clearing, hidden among the trees, was an old cabin. It was falling apart, the roof caved in, the walls covered in moss and vines. But it was the sign above the door that caught my It was supposed to be a straightforward drive, just a quick trip from my place to the outskirts of town to visit my brother. Midnight Road was a route I'd driven countless times before, a narrow, winding road that cut through a dense stretch of forest. The trees on either side were thick and towering, their branches reaching over the road like skeletal arms. During the day, it was a scenic drive, peaceful even. But at night, the road had a different kind of vibe, isolated, lonely, and frankly unsettling. I'd never been one to scare easily, though so I didn't think much of it. That night, however, something was different. I was about halfway down Midnight Road when I noticed the first sign that something was wrong. My headlights cut through the darkness ahead, but the trees seemed to close in around me, their shadows deeper, more ominous than I remembered. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I saw a pair of glowing eyes reflecting in my headlights just off the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer. They were common in these parts, and I'd nearly hit one more than once while driving this road. But as I slowed down, squinting through the windshield to get a better look, I realized that what I was seeing was no deer. The eyes were too high off the ground, too wide apart. Whatever it was big, and it was watching me. I felt a chill run down my spine as I drove past, my foot instinctively pressing harder on the gas pedal. As I did, the thing move, it stepped out of the shadows and onto the road behind me, its massive form illuminated briefly in my rearview mirror. My breath caught in my throat. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, tall, hulking, and covered in dark, matted fur. Its limbs were long and muscular, ending in what looked like clawed hands, and its face was something out of a nightmare, a twisted, snarling, wolf-like snout, with sharp teeth that gleamed in the moonlight. I didn't wait to get a better look. I floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as I sped down the road, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the image of that thing from my mind, the way it had looked at me with those cold, intelligent eyes. It was no animal, at least. Not any kind I'd ever seen. It was something else, something wrong. As I sped away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it chasing after me. But the road behind me was empty, the darkness swallowing everything in its path. I told myself I was safe, that whatever it was gone. But the fear gnawed at me, a cold, creeping dread that settled deep in my bones. The rest of the drive was a blur. I barely remember pulling into my brother's driveway, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. When I finally stepped inside, I was still in a daze, my mind racing with thoughts of what I'd seen. I wanted to tell him, to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain something that didn't make sense, something that shouldn't exist? That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again, those glowing eyes, that snarling face. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing as if I'd been running for miles. I knew I couldn't stay there. I couldn't risk driving back down Midnight Road. Not with that thing out there. But I had no choice. I couldn't stay at my brother's indefinitely, and there was no other route back home. The next day, I left as early as I could, hoping that whatever it was, it wouldn't be around in the daylight. The drive back was tense, every shadow in the trees making my heart skip a beat. But the road was quiet, just as it always had been. No sign of the creature, no glowing eyes watching me from the darkness. By the time I reached home, I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing, that it was just a trick of the light or a particularly vivid nightmare. But deep down, I knew better. I knew what I had seen, and I knew it was real. Over the next few days, I tried to put it out of my mind to get back to my routine, but the unease never left me. The nights were the worst. I couldn't sleep, my mind replaying that moment over and over again. And then the dreams started. In my dreams, I was back on Midnight Road, driving through the darkness. But this time I wasn't alone. The creature was there, following me, its glowing eyes locked onto me as it closed in. No matter how fast I drove, it was always there, just a step behind, its claws scraping against the asphalt as it chased me down. I would wake up just before it caught me, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. Tut, it wasn't long before the dreams started to bleed into reality. I would be walking down the street or sitting at home, and suddenly I would see the creature watching me from a distance, its eyes glowing in the shadows. I knew it wasn't really there, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it felt so real, so terrifyingly real, that I couldn't shake the fear. Then one night, it wasn't just a dream. I was driving home from work, the sun setting behind me, casting long shadows across the road. I had taken a different route, avoiding Midnight Road at all costs, but as I drove, I felt that familiar sense of unease creeping over me. I told myself it was nothing, just leftover anxiety from the dreams. But then I saw it dot in the distance. Just at the edge of the forest, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized the shape, the tall, hulking form, the dark, matted fur. It was the creature, the one from my nightmares, standing there, watching me. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The creature didn't move, didn't even flinch. It just stood there, staring at me with those glowing eyes. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stare back, frozen in place by fear. And then it started to move. It took a step towards me, its massive form moving with a fluid grace that seemed unnatural for something so big. I could see its muscles rippling under its fur, its claws digging into the dirt as it approached. I knew I should drive, should get out of there as fast as I could, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with terror, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body refusing to obey. The creature took another step, and another, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. It was only a few feet away now, close enough that I could see the snarl on its face, the glint of its teeth in the fading light. I finally snapped out of my trance, my survival instincts kicking in. I slammed the car into reverse, the tires spinning as I backed away as fast as I could. The creature lunged towards me, its claws scraping against the car door as I sped away. I didn't stop until I was miles away, my heart racing, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely hold on to the steering wheel. I didn't know what to do, where to go. All I knew was that I couldn't go back. Not to Midnight Road, not to my home, not anywhere near that thing. I drove to a motel on the outskirts of town, not trusting myself to drive any further. I checked in, my hands still trembling as I handed over my credit card. The clerk gave me a concerned look, but I didn't care. I just needed to get inside, to lock the door and hide away from whatever was out there. That night, I barely slept. Every noise, every creak of the building had me on edge, expecting the creature to burst through the door at any moment. But the night passed uneventfully, and by morning I almost believed I was safe. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. I knew the creature was still out there, watching, waiting, and I knew it wouldn't stop until it had me. I moved out of the city the next day, leaving everything behind. My job, my apartment, my life. I didn't care. I just needed to get as far away from that place as possible. I drove for hours, putting as much distance between myself and Midnight Road as I could. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the fear, the knowledge that the creature was still out there. It's been years since that night, and I've never gone back. I've tried to rebuild my life, to forget what happened, but the memory never fades. I still see the creature in my dreams, still feel its eyes on me when I'm alone at night. And sometimes, when I'm driving down a dark, deserted road, I catch a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, a shadow, a flash of movement. I tell myself it's nothing, just my imagination. But I know the truth. The creature is still out there, somewhere, waiting, and one day it will find me again. I've been a trucker for nearly 20 years, and I've seen just about everything you can imagine on the road. Late-night drives through the middle of nowhere, strange lights in the sky, even a few close calls with wildlife that left my heart racing. But nothing prepared me for what I experienced on a stretch of highway in the Arizona desert tonight that still haunts me to this day. It was the middle of summer, and I was hauling a load of goods from Los Angeles to Dallas. The route took me through some of the most desolate parts of the country, miles of empty highway surrounded by nothing but sand and scrub. I'd driven this route plenty of times before and knew it like the back of my hand. It was long, lonely, and hot, but I didn't mind. I'd crank up the AC, put on some music, and settle in for the ride. That night I was making good time. The road was quiet, hardly any traffic, and the sky was clear, filled with stars. I was about halfway through the trip, somewhere near the Arizona-New Mexico border, when I noticed something strange. Up ahead in the distance, I saw headlights, but they weren't moving. They were just sitting there, right in the middle of the road. As I got closer, I slowed down, trying to figure out what was going on. It was an old sedan, beat up and rusty, with the driver's door hanging open. There was no one in sight, no sign of any other vehicles. I pulled over, leaving my engine running, and grabbed my flashlight. I wasn't about to just drive past without making sure everything was okay after all. This was the middle of nowhere, and if someone was in trouble, they wouldn't have much help out here. I stepped out of the cab, the desert air hitting me like a furnace. The silence was almost oppressive, the only sound the low hum of my truck's engine. I called out, but there was no answer. The car was empty, just as I'd thought, but the engine was still warm. Someone had been here recently, but where had they gone? I shined my light around, searching for any sign of the driver. The desert stretched out in every direction, flat and barren, with nowhere to hide. But as I moved the beam of light along the side of the road, something caught my eye, a set of footprints leading away from the car and off into the desert. Now, I'm not one to spook easily, but something about those footprints gave me pause. They were deep, as if whoever had made them had been running, and they led straight out into the darkness, away from the safety of the highway. It didn't make any sense. Why would someone just abandon their car and take off into the desert? I hesitated, thinking about getting back in my truck and driving on. But something pulled me forward, a nagging feeling that I couldn't just leave without knowing what had happened. Against my better judgment, I followed the footprints, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The farther I went, the more uneasy I felt. The footprints continued in a straight line, no sign of hesitation or turning back. It was as if whoever had made them had been drawn out into the desert by something or someone. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, but I kept going. After about a quarter of a mile, I saw a figure in the distance, standing perfectly still. My heart skipped a beat, and I stopped in my tracks. It was too dark to make out any details, but it was definitely a person just standing there, facing away from me. "Hey," I called out, but they didn't respond. I started to walk faster, closing the distance between us. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Still no answer. I was getting closer now, close enough to see that it was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark suit. He was completely still, not even turning to look at me. Something about the way he was standing, so rigid and unnatural, made my skin crawl. I slowed down, keeping my distance. "Sir, are you okay?" That's when he turned around. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were wide, staring right through me. But it wasn't his eyes that froze me in my tracks, it was his mouth, twisted into a grin that stretched far too wide, as if someone had taken a knife and carved it into his face. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. He just stood there, grinning at me, his eyes unblinking. And then, without a sound, he started walking toward me. I don't remember much of what happened next. My instincts took over, and I turned and ran, my legs pumping as fast as they could carry me. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps quick and light. It's almost like he was gliding over the sand. I didn't dare look back, didn't want to see that twisted grin again. When I reached the highway, I sprinted back to my truck, my heart pounding in my chest. I jumped into the cab, slammed the door shut, and floored the gas. The tires screeched as I pulled away, the headlights cutting through the darkness. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figure standing in the middle of the road, watching me as I sped away, that grin still plastered on his face. I didn't stop driving until I reached a truck stop on the outskirts of the next town. I was shaking, drenched in sweat, my mind racing. I tried to make sense of what I'd seen, but it was impossible. Who was that man? Why had he been out there in the desert? And what had happened to the driver of that car? I never found out. The next day, I called the local authorities and told them what had happened. They sent out a patrol, but they didn't find anything, no car, no footprints, and no sign of the man I'd seen. It was as if it had all been a bad dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the heat of the desert. But I know what I saw, and I know it was real, After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the man with the twisted grin was still out there somewhere. Every time I drove that stretch of highway, I'd feel a chill run down my spine, my eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of him. But I never saw him again, and for that I'm grateful. I still drive that route from time to time, but I'm more cautious now, more aware of the strange and inexplicable things that can happen out there on the road. The desert is a vast, empty place, full of secrets and shadows that most people will never see. But I've seen one of them, and I'll never forget it. Some nights when I'm driving through the desert alone, I think about that man, about the way he just stood there, grinning at me in the darkness, and I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the next unlucky driver to cross his path. All I know is that I was lucky to get away, and I don't plan on going back to find out what he wanted. The hospital I worked at was old, built in the early 1900s. It had seen thousands of patients over the years, many of whom had never left. I was a night shift nurse, assigned to the fourth floor, the one everyone else avoided. They said it was cursed, that too many people had died there, and that their spirits still lingered. I didn't believe in ghosts, so I volunteered for the shift without hesitation. It was just another floor, just another night. Or so I thought. My first night on the fourth floor was quiet, almost too quiet. The other nurses had warned me that strange things happened up there, but I brushed it off as superstition. The old building creaked and groaned as the wind howled outside, but that was normal for a place its age. I went about my rounds, checking on patients and administering medications, just like any other night. Around 2 a.m., I heard the sound of a woman crying. It was faint at first, but it grew louder as I walked down the hallway. I checked each room, but the patients were all asleep. The crying continued, echoing through the empty corridor. It seemed to be coming from one of the rooms at the end of the hall, a room that had been empty for years. I hesitated for a moment before opening the door. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside. The bed was neatly made, just as it had been since the last patient had passed away in it. But the crying persisted, louder now, as if the woman was right beside me. I felt a cold breeze brush against my skin, sending a shiver down my spine. I tried to turn on the light, but the switch didn't work. The room remained shrouded in darkness, the crying relentless. I backed out of the room, closing the door behind me. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in the air, a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. I returned to the nurse's station, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. I told myself it was just the old building playing tricks on me, that the crying had been the wind or a distant echo. But when I sat down to chart my rounds, the lights above me flickered. I looked up just in time to see a shadow move across the hallway, too fast to be a person, too real to be a trick of the light. I jumped out of my chair, my heart racing. I wasn't alone up there. I grabbed my flashlight and hurried down the hall, determined to find out what was going on. But when I reached the end of the corridor, the shadow was gone. The hallway was empty. The only sound the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. I checked every room, but they were all empty. The patients were still asleep and disturbed by whatever had just happened. I was about to head back to the nurse's station when I heard it again, the crying, faint and distant, coming from the same room as before. This time it was accompanied by a whisper, soft and pleading, calling my name. I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I didn't want to go back to that room, didn't want to face whatever was inside, but the voice kept calling over and over, growing more desperate with each passing second. I couldn't ignore it. I had to know what was happening, had to know if I was losing my mind. I slowly approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The crying grew louder, more intense, as if the woman was right on the other side, begging for help. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, just as it had been before, but the bed wasn't neatly made anymore. The sheets were ruffled, as if someone had been thrashing around in them. And there, on the pillow, was a dark stain, fresh and wet. Like blood, I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The crying stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from behind me. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the hallway, but there was no one there. The air was thick with tension, the coldness seeping into my bones. I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. I didn't wait to find out who or what was there. I ran down the hallway, not stopping until I reached the elevator. I punched the button frantically, praying for the doors to open. When they finally did, I threw myself inside, my hands shaking as I hit the button for the first floor. The doors slid shut, and I breathed a sigh of relief. But as the elevator descended, the lights flickered again, and I heard the crying this time, right behind me. I turned and slowly, red pooling in my stomach. There, in the corner of the elevator, was a woman. She was pale, her eyes sunken and hollow, her hair matted and wet. She was wearing a hospital gown, and her hands were covered in blood. She looked at me with such sadness, such despair, that I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, and then she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Help me." The elevator jolted to a stop, the lights flickering wildly. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart racing as the woman stepped closer, her eyes locked on mine. She reached out a hand, blood dripping from her fingers, and I screamed. The doors opened, and I bolted out of the elevator, not stopping until I was outside, the cool night air hitting my face. I turned to look back, expecting to see her following me, but the elevator was empty. The hospital was silent, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. I never went back to that floor, never took the night shift again. I couldn't shake the image of that woman, her hollow eyes and desperate plea for help. I found out later that she had been a patient on the 4th floor, one of the many who had died there. They said she had been waiting for someone to help her, someone to save her from the pain and suffering she had endured. But no one had, and she was still waiting. It started when I moved into the old house on Birchwood Street. The place was a steel quaint, 2-story Victorian-style home with a spacious yard surrounded by towering oaks that shaded the property. It was the kind of place I'd always dreamed of living in, a perfect mix of charm and history. The previous owner had passed away, and the house had been on the market for a while, which is why I got it for such a good price. But looking back, I should have known there was a reason it was so cheap. The first few weeks in the house were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, settling in, and getting to know the neighborhood. The house creaked and groaned at night, but I figure it was just the sounds of an old building settling. I didn't think much of it until the night I found the attic door open. I had never been up to the attic before. The door was small, hidden in the ceiling of a hallway closet, and I had no reason to go up there. But one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed the door was ajar, the wooden ladder hanging down into the hallway. I stared at it for a long moment, my heart beating a little faster than usual. I was sure I hadn't opened it. I lived alone. There was no one else who could have. The thought of someone or something up there sent a shiver down my spine. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously climbed the ladder, shining the light into the dark, dusty space above. The attic was empty, just a few old boxes, some cobwebs, and a thick layer of dust covering everything. I breathed a sigh of relief, telling myself it was probably just the wind that had blown the door open. I closed it, made sure it was securely latched, and went to bed. But that night I had the first of many nightmares. In the dream, I was standing in the attic, surrounded by shadows that seemed to move on their own. There was a feeling of something watching me, something malevolent lurking just out of sight. I tried to leave, but the ladder was gone, and the shadows began to close in, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The sense of dread from the dream lingered, making it hard to fall back asleep. The next morning, I told myself it was just stress. Moving into a new house, adjusting to a new routine, it was all perfectly normal to have weird dreams. But the unease from the night before didn't go away. I found myself avoiding the hallway where the attic door was, not wanting to even look at it. I started hearing things, faint whispers in the middle of the night, strange noises that seemed to come from the walls. I would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps above me, even though I knew there was no one else in the house. Then things started to go missing. At first, it was little things, a set of keys, a book, a piece of jewelry. I would search the entire house, only to find the missing item in a place I was sure I hadn't put it. Then I started finding things that weren't mine, old, dusty trinkets that looked like they had been in the house for years, hidden away in drawers and closets. One day, I found an old, tattered doll in the basement, its glass eyes staring blankly up at me. I had never seen it before, and I certainly hadn't put it there. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, especially at night. I started leaving all the lights on, hoping it would keep the darkness at bay. But the nightmares continued, growing more vivid, more terrifying. In my dreams, the shadows took on the shape of a man, tall and thin, with eyes that glowed in the darkness. He would stand in the corner of the room, watching me, whispering in that same, indecipherable language. I would wake up, gasping for breath, the fear gripping me so tightly I could barely move. One night I woke up to find the attic door open again. The ladder was down, and a cold draft blew down the hallway. I lay in bed, staring at the open door, too terrified to move. I wanted to believe it was just the wind again, but deep down I knew something was wrong. I could feel it, a presence in the house, something that didn't belong. I finally mustered the courage to get out of bed and climb the ladder. The attic was just as I had left it, empty, dusty, and cold. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a small wooden box tucked away in a corner. I picked it up, brushing off the dust, and opened it. Inside was an old, yellowed piece of paper, covered in strange symbols and writing I couldn't understand. There was also a photograph, a black and white picture of a man and a woman standing in front of the house. The man looked familiar, though I couldn't place where I had seen him before. The woman's face, however, was blurred, as if someone had smeared the photo. I took the box downstairs, planning to do some research on the house and its previous owners. But as soon as I crossed the threshold of the attic, the box suddenly felt heavy, almost as if something was pulling it back. I nearly dropped it, the weight so sudden and unexpected. I managed to get it to the kitchen table, where I spread out the contents, trying to make sense of what I had found. The symbols on the paper were unlike anything I had ever seen before, jagged, angular shapes that seemed to twist and writhe on the page. The writing was in a language I didn't recognize, and the more I looked at it, the more uneasy I felt. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was written on that paper was dangerous, something I wasn't meant to understand. I spent hours searching online for any information about the house or the symbols, but I found nothing. The house had no history of hauntings or strange occurrences, no record of anything out of the ordinary. It was just an old house, like any other, but I knew better. I could feel it in my bones. Something was wrong with this place, something dark and evil. The nightmares continued to worsen, and the sense of being watched became unbearable. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, and feel a cold presence in the room with me. I started hearing voices, whispers that seemed to come from the walls, calling my name. I would turn on all the lights, hoping to chase away the darkness, but it didn't help. The house was no longer a home, it was a prison, and I was trapped inside. One night I woke up to the sound of someone breathing heavily beside my bed. I froze, too terrified to move. The breathing was slow and deep, like someone was standing right next to me. I could feel the weight of their presence, the cold air pressing down on me. I slowly turned my head, expecting to see the shadowy figure from my dreams, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, but the breathing continued, growing louder, closer. I bolted out of bed, running down the stairs and out the front door. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing in the middle of the yard, gasping for breath. The house loomed behind me, dark and foreboding, its windows like empty eyes staring back at me. I knew I couldn't go back inside, not with whatever was in there, but I had nowhere else to go. I spent the rest of the night in my car, too afraid to go back into the house. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that it was just stress, but I knew it wasn't true. Something was in that house, something evil, and it wasn't going to leave me alone. The next day I called a priest. I didn't know what else to do. I explained everything to him, expecting him to tell me I was crazy, but he didn't. He listened carefully, his expression growing more serious as I spoke. When I finished, he nodded and agreed to come to the house. The priest arrived later that day, a solemn look on his face. He walked through the house, Sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers, I followed him, clutching the wooden box, hoping that it would help. But as he entered the hallway where the attic door was, he stopped, his face paling. "Something dark is here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been here a long time." He turned to me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. "This house, it's cursed. Whatever is here, it's not going to leave easily." I asked him what I could do, how I could get rid of it. He shook his head. "It's not something you can fight. You need to leave this place as soon as possible." I didn't argue. I packed a bag and left the house that night, not looking back. I didn't care about the house, the money I had spent on it, none of it mattered. I just wanted to get away, to be free of whatever was haunting me. I moved across the country, trying to start a new life, to forget what had happened. But the nightmares followed me. Every night I would dream of the shadowy figure, the whispers, the cold presence in the room. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just my imagination. But deep down I knew the truth. The house wasn't cursed, I was. Whatever had been in that attic, it had latched onto me, followed me, and it wasn't going to let go. I started seeing the figure in the corner of my eye, just a glimpse before it vanished. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, calling my name, telling me to come back. The dreams became more vivid, more real, until I couldn't tell where the dream ended and reality began. But I know it's only a matter of time before it finds me again, before it takes me back to that house, to the attic. I don't know what it wants, but I know it's not going to stop until it gets it. And when it does, I don't think I'll be able to escape. The town I grew up in had an abandoned school. On the outskirts, a decaying relic of a time long past. It had been closed for decades, ever since a tragic fire claimed the lives of several students and a teacher. The building had been left to rot, its charred walls and shattered windows a grim reminder of the disaster. As kids, we were always told to stay away from it, that it was dangerous, and that it was haunted. But that only made it more intriguing. It became the stuff of local legend, a place where dares were made, and ghost stories were born. I was in my late teens when I finally decided to explore it. My friends and I had always talked about it, but none of us had ever actually gone inside. We'd heard the stories, of course the sounds of children laughing when there was no one there, the shadowy figures seen moving through the halls at night. But we didn't really believe any of it. It was just a spooky old building, and we were too old to be scared of ghost stories, or so we thought. It was a warm summer evening, and we finally decided to go. There were 4 of us, me, Dom, Sarah, and Jake. We armed ourselves with flashlights, determined to spend the night in the school and see if the stories were true. It was supposed to be a fun adventure, a way to prove to ourselves that we weren't scared. But from the moment we stepped through the broken front doors, I knew something was wrong. The air inside was thick and heavy, filled with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic, like blood. The walls were covered in graffiti, layers upon layers of it, as if every kid who had ever dared to enter had left their mark. The floors were littered with debris, broken glass, crumbling plaster, and old, forgotten toys. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the creaking of the old building as it settled into the night. We started in the main hallway, our flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The classrooms were still filled with old desks and chairs, covered in dust and grime. In one room, the blackboard was still covered with a lesson from decades ago, the chalk faded but still legible. It was as if the school had been frozen in time. Abandoned in the middle of a normal day. We split up. each of us taking a different part of the school to explore. I ended up in the gymnasium, a vast, echoing space filled with the remains of old sports equipment. The ceiling was high with broken windows that let in slivers of moonlight. The bleachers were covered in dust, the basketball hoops hanging at odd angles. As I walked across the floor, my footsteps echoed back at me, making the space feel even larger and emptier. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I almost didn't catch it. I stopped, holding my breath, straining to hear, but the whisper came again, this time louder, clearer. It was a child's voice calling my name. My heart skipped a beat, and I swung my flashlight around, searching for the source of the sound. But there was nothing, just empty space and shadows. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe one of my friends playing a trick on me. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. The voice had been too clear, too real. I turned to leave the gym, my pulse quickening. But before I could reach the door, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I stood there, frozen, the darkness pressing in on me. My flashlight flickered, the beam weak and sputtering. I tried to turn it off and on again, but it was no use. The batteries were dying, and the darkness seemed to swallow up the little light I had left. The whispers came again, closer now, more insistent. I could hear footsteps, the soft patter of small feet on the dusty floor, but I still couldn't see anything. Panic set in, and I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing loudly in the darkness. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get out. But the school was a maze, and in the darkness, every hallway looked the same. I could hear the whispers all around me now, overlapping and growing louder, filling my head with the sound of children's voices, calling my name, begging for help. I burst into a classroom, slamming the door behind me. My flashlight flickered again, giving me just enough light to see that the room was empty, the desks overturned and covered in dust. I backed into a corner, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers were outside the door now, scratching and tapping, as if something was trying to get in. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The voices were inside my head, digging into my brain, filling me with a sense of dread so overwhelming that I thought I might pass out. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence was deafening, almost worse than the whispers. I opened my eyes, and the room was still dark, but I could see the faint outline of a figure standing in the doorway. It was small, no taller than a child, but its features were obscured, shrouded in darkness. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. As it slowly began to walk toward me, my flashlight sputtered one last time, and in that brief flash of light I saw its face. It was a girl, no older than 10, with long, tangled hair and hollow, empty eyes. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her mouth was twisted into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was dressed in an old-fashioned school uniform, dirty and torn, as if she had been wearing it for years. She stopped in front of me, her empty eyes locked on mine, and I felt a chill run through me, so cold it felt like ice in my veins. She reached out a hand, her fingers brushing against my arm, and I felt a jolt of pain so intense that it took my breath away. I tried to pull away, but I couldn't move, couldn't escape her grip. "Help me," she whispered, her voice echoing in my head, and I knew then that she wasn't alive, that she had been one of the children who had died in the fire all those years ago, and that she was still trapped here, still waiting for someone to save her. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in fear, but eventually the light in my flashlight died completely, leaving me in total darkness. When I finally found the strength to move, she was gone. The room was empty, the door still closed. But I could still feel her touch, still hear her voice in my head begging for help. I stumbled out of the classroom, my legs weak and shaking. The whispers were gone, the school silent once more, but I could still feel her presence, still hear the echo of her voice in my mind. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. My friends were already there, their faces pale and scared. They'd heard the whispers, too, seen the shadows moving in the dark. None of us spoke as we left, too shaken by what we'd experienced. We never went back to that school, never talked about what happened that night. But I know that she's still there, still waiting, still calling out for someone to help her. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I can still hear her voice, whispering my name, begging for me to come back. The night shift at the old Greystone Mill was supposed to be an easy gig. I'd taken the job because it was quiet, and I needed the money. The mill had been shut down for years, nothing but a relic of the past in a small, dying town. My job was simple: make the rounds, check the perimeter, and keep an eye out for vandals or squatters. It was just me and the silence of the night, and that suited me just fine. The first few weeks were uneventful. I'd spend my nights patrolling the crumbling corridors and empty rooms, listening to the wind whistle through the broken windows and the occasional creak of the old building settling. The place had a strange atmosphere, there was no denying that, but I chalked it up to the age of the structure and the fact that it was isolated, standing alone on the edge of town. Then one night, things started to change. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., when I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from deep within the mill. It wasn't unusual to hear odd noises in a place like this, but this was different. It was steady, deliberate, like someone tapping a stick against the concrete floor in a slow, measured pattern. I followed the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness as I navigated the maze of corridors. The tapping grew louder as I approached the old storage area, a part of the mill that had always given me the creeps. The air grew colder, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as I got closer. I rounded the corner and stopped dead in my tracks. The room was empty, just a wide, open space filled with dust and debris. But the tapping continued, echoing off the walls as if it was coming from all directions at once. I shined my light around, trying to find the source, but there was nothing, no one. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. After a few minutes, I turned and made my way back to the security office, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The next night, it happened again. This time, the tapping started as soon as I began my rounds, the sound coming from the same direction as before. I hesitated, not sure if I wanted to follow it again, but curiosity got the better of me. I made my way back to the storage area, my flashlight flickering as I moved through the darkened hallways. When I reached the room, the tapping stopped, just like the night before. But this time there was something else, a low, barely audible whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I couldn't make out the words, but it sent a chill down my spine. I scanned the room again, but there was nothing, just the darkness and the cold. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd heard. Who would believe me? It was an old building, full of strange noises and echoes. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it, something that wasn't right. The tapping and the whispering continued every night after that, always leading me back to that same spot, always stopping the moment I arrived. One night I decided to set up a camera in the storage area, hoping to catch whatever was making the noise. I placed it in the corner, pointing it toward the center of the room, and then went back to the security office to watch the feed. For hours there was nothing, just the empty room, the dust swirling in the beams of the flashlight I'd left on. Then, around 3 a.m., the tapping started again. I leaned in closer to the monitor, watching intently as the sound grew louder. The camera feed flickered, the image distorting for a moment before returning to normal. And then I saw it, a shadow, just a faint outline moving across the screen. It was tall and thin, barely visible in the dim light, but it was there, walking slowly across the room. My heart raced as I watched the figure stop in the center of the room, its form shimmering in the light. It stood there for a moment, and then it turned, as if looking directly at the camera. The feed flickered again, and when it came back, the shadow was gone. The room was empty once more, but the tapping continued, growing louder and more frantic. I bolted from the office, running down the hallway toward the storage area. I wasn't sure what I was going to do when I got there, but I had to see it for myself. When I reached the room, I stopped in the doorway, my flashlight sweeping across the floor. The room was empty, just like before, but the tapping was louder than ever, echoing through the walls, the floor, the very air around me. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, the shadow, moving along the far wall. It was taller than I had imagined, its form dark and indistinct, but unmistakably human. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its footsteps silent despite the noise filling the room. I stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to breathe. As it approached, the shadow stopped a few feet in front of me, and for the first time I could see its face, or rather the lack of one. Where a face should have been, there was nothing but darkness, an empty void that seemed to pull at me, drawing me closer. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a cold, suffocating fear that gripped my chest and squeezed the air from my lungs. And then it spoke. The voice was low, raspy, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the noise like a knife. It said my name, dragging out the syllables in a slow, menacing drawl. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to get away, but I couldn't move. The darkness surrounded me, pulling me in, closer and closer. Suddenly the lights flickered on, and the shadow was gone. The tapping stopped, the room silent once more. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, my heart racing. I looked around, but there was no sign of the figure, no trace of the darkness that had been there moments before. I didn't stay to find out what would happen next. I ran out of the building, leaving my gear behind, and didn't stop until I was in my car, speeding away from the mill as fast as I could. I never went back, never picked up my last paycheck. I didn't care, I just wanted to be as far away from that place as possible. It's been years since that night, but the memory still haunts me. I've tried to forget, tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but I know better. Something was in that mill, something dark and malevolent, and it wasn't going to let me go so easily. Even now I can still hear the tapping sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the shadows are long. It's a reminder, a warning, that no matter how far I run, I can't escape what happened. The darkness is always there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I've been driving trucks for over 20 years, and in all that time I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road. There are stories that get passed around at truck stops, tales of phantom trucks and shadowy figures that seem to appear out of nowhere. I always thought they were just that stories told to spook the new guys or pass the time on a long haul. That was until I had my own encounter with something I can't explain. It was a few years back, late November, and I was hauling a load of produce from California to New York. The weather had been rough cold with patches of ice on the roads that made the driving slow and treacherous. I was somewhere in Ohio, about 100 miles outside of Columbus, when I decided to pull over for the night. I'd been on the road for almost 10 hours, and the snow was starting to fall heavy. The last thing I wanted was to be stuck out in the middle of nowhere if the weather turned worse. I'd heard about Kilroy's truck stop from other drivers, an old, run-down place that was supposed to be haunted. Most guys avoided it, preferring to drive the extra miles to a better spot. But I was tired, and the snow was coming down hard. So when I saw the faded sign for Kilroy's, I decided to pull in and call it a night. The place was just as run down as I'd heard, an old, crumbling building with a few pumps out front and a gravel lot that looked like it hadn't been paved in years. There were a couple of other rigs parked in the lot, their drivers either asleep in their cabs or hunkered down inside. I parked near the edge of the lot, away from the other trucks, and settled in for the night. The wind was howling outside, shaking the cab, and the snow was coming down in thick, heavy flakes. I could hear the sound of the pumps creaking in the wind, the metal groaning as the storm picked up. I was just about to doze off when I heard a faint knocking, like someone tapping on the side of my truck. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, louder this time. I sat up, peering out the window into the darkness, but all I could see was the swirling snow. The knocking came again, more insistent now, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I've been on the road long enough to know when something's not right, and this definitely wasn't right. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, stepping out into the freezing wind. The cold hit me like a slap, and I had to shield my eyes against the blowing snow. I walked around to the back of the truck, my boots crunching in the gravel. But there was nothing there, no one standing by the trailer, no footprints in the snow, just the wind and the darkness, and the feeling that I was being watched. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, and climbed back into the cab. But the feeling didn't go away. It was like a weight in the air, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I tried to settle back in, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when the radio crackled to life. I hadn't turned it on, and it wasn't even set to a station, just static hissing through the speakers. But through the static I could hear a voice, faint at first, but growing louder, clearer. It was a man's voice, deep and gravelly, saying something I couldn't quite make out. I reached for the dial, trying to turn it off, but the voice kept coming, growing louder, more urgent. I could make out the words now. Get out, over and over again, like a warning. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, even in the cold. I yanked the plug out of the radio, cutting the sound off abruptly. The cab was silent again, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I could feel eyes on me, feel something standing just outside the truck, waiting. I started the engine, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I didn't care about the snow, didn't care about the ice on the roads. I just needed to get out of there. As I pulled out of the lot, my headlights swept over the building, and for a split second I saw it standing in the doorway of the truck stop, a figure tall and thin, dressed in black, with eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. It was watching me, its gaze following me as I drove away. I didn't stop driving until I was miles down the road. The truck stopped far behind me. The snow was still coming down hard, and the roads were slick with ice, but I didn't care. I just kept driving, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel, my heart racing in my chest. I finally pulled into a rest area near Columbus, the lights of the city a welcome sight after the darkness of the road. I parked in a well-lit spot, surrounded by other trucks, and tried to calm down. But I couldn't stop thinking about that figure, about the voice on the radio telling me to get out. I didn't sleep much that night, and when I finally did, I was plagued by nightmares. I saw that figure again, standing in the doorway of the truck stop, watching me, waiting. I could hear the voice in my dreams, repeating those same words. Get out, get out. I've talked to other drivers since then, guys who've stopped at Kilroy's, and they've all had similar stories. Some say they've seen the figure too. Others have heard the voice on the radio warning them to leave. But no one knows who or what it is, or why it's haunting that old truck stop. I haven't been back to Kilroy's since that night, and I don't plan to. There are plenty of other places to stop, places that don't leave you with the feeling that you've just escaped something dark and dangerous. But I can't forget what I saw, can't shake the feeling that whatever it was is still out there, waiting for the next driver to come along. And every time I pass that stretch of road, I feel a shiver of fear, a reminder of that night, and the voice that warned me to get out while I still could. I didn't want to go to the dinner party, but my wife insisted. It's just one night, she said, and it's important to them. Besides, it's Halloween, it'll be fun. I reluctantly agreed, knowing that I couldn't say no to her. We had only moved into the neighborhood a few months ago, and making a good impression on our new neighbors was important, even if it meant spending the evening with people we barely knew. The party was at the Thompsons' house, a large, old Victorian that had stood in the neighborhood for over a century. The house had a reputation, of course every old house does. People said it was haunted, that strange things happened there, especially around Halloween. I didn't believe in that sort of thing, but I had to admit the house did have a certain unsettling vibe to it. We arrived at the house just as the sun was setting, the sky turning a deep orange before fading into the black of night. The Thompsons greeted us warmly, and we were ushered into the grand, dimly lit parlor where the other guests were already mingling. There were about a dozen of us in total, all gathered around the large dining table that had been set up in the middle of the room. The evening started off pleasant enough. There was wine, laughter, and conversation, the usual small talk you'd expect at a gathering like this. But as the night went on, something began to feel off. It started with the strange noises, faint creaks and groans that seemed to come from the walls themselves. At first I thought it was just the house settling, but the sounds grew louder, more pronounced, as if something was moving within the walls. I wasn't the only one who noticed. The other guests began to glance around nervously, their conversations growing quieter as the noises continued. My wife squeezed my hand under the table, her expression uneasy. "It's just the house," I whispered to her, trying to reassure myself as much as her. Then, just as dessert was being served, the power went out. The room was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the few candles that had been lit around the room. There was a moment of silence, broken only by the sound of someone nervously laughing, trying to lighten the mood. But no one joined in. We sat in the darkness for what felt like an eternity, the air thick with tension. I could hear the others shifting in their seats, whispering to one another. Then, out of nowhere, there was a loud crash from the kitchen. Everyone jumped, turning to look in the direction of the noise. The Thompsons exchanged worried glances before Mr. Thompson stood up, grabbing a flashlight from a nearby drawer. "I'll go check it out," he said, his voice wavering slightly. He disappeared into the kitchen, the beam of his flashlight bobbing as he moved through the darkness. We all sat in silence, listening to the sound of his footsteps growing fainter as he moved deeper into the house. A few minutes passed, and then we heard a low, guttural moan, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. My heart started racing as the noise grew louder, closer. Mrs. Thompson stood up, her face pale, and hurried towards the kitchen, calling her husband's name. Before she could reach the door, it slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. We all jumped, and she let out a startled scream, pounding on the door, trying to get it open, but it wouldn't budge, as if something or someone was holding it shut from the other side. We could hear Mr. Thompson shouting now, his voice muffled and panicked. The dragging sound continued, followed by another low moan that sent a shiver down my spine. Mrs. Thompson was frantic, pounding on the door with both fists, her cries growing more desperate by the second. And then, as suddenly as it started, the noises stopped. The house fell silent, save for Mrs. Thompson's sobs as she continued to beat on the door. We all sat frozen in our seats, too terrified to move, too scared to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, the door slowly creaked open. Mrs. Thompson gasped and stepped back, her hands covering her mouth in horror. We all turned to look, and what we saw made my blood run cold. Mr. Thompson was standing in the doorway, his clothes torn and blooded. His eyes were wide with terror, his face pale and gaunt. But it wasn't just the sight of him that made my stomach churn. It was what was behind him. A dark, shadowy figure stood just behind him, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly arms that seemed to stretch out toward us. For a moment, none of us moved. We just stared, too shocked to do anything but watch as the figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Mr. Thompson let out a strangled cry as the figure reached out and grabbed him, pulling him back into the darkness of the kitchen. The door slammed shut again, and this time it didn't open. We could hear Mr. Thompson's screams echoing through the house, followed by the sound of something wet and heavy hitting the floor. Mrs. Thompson collapsed to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably, while the rest of us sat frozen in place, our minds struggling to comprehend what had just happened. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I knew, I was outside, standing in the cold night air, my wife clutching my arm. The other guests were there too, all of us pale and shaken, unable to speak. We didn't go back to the Thompsons' house. No one did. The police were called, of course, but they never found anything, no trace of Mr. Thompson, no sign of the figure we'd all seen. The official report said he'd gone missing, and that was that. But we knew the truth. We knew what we'd seen. The town moved on, as towns do. But the memory of that night never left me. I still see it sometimes. In my nightmares, the tall, dark figure with its outstretched arms, the look of terror on Mr. Thompson's face as he was pulled into the darkness. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the wind is howling outside, I swear I can hear the sound of something being dragged across the floor. I grew up in a small town, nestled in the heart of Appalachia, surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else, and secrets are hard to keep. But there was one secret that everyone knew, and no one spoke about: the curse of Waverly Woods. It was the kind of story you heard as a kid, whispered in hushed tones around campfires or late at night when the grown-ups were out of earshot. The kind of story that would make you think twice about venturing too deep into the woods alone. But like most kids, I didn't really believe it. I mean, sure, there were some strange things about Waverly Woods, the way the trees seemed to close in around you, the way the wind would whistle through the branches like a distant, mournful cry but a curse. That sounded like something out of a fairy tale. Then, one summer, everything changed. I was 18, just out of high school, and looking for a way to make some quick money before heading off to college. My friend Jake and I had been doing odd jobs around town, mowing lawns, painting fences, that sort of thing, when old Mr. Harris offered us a job clearing out some land on the edge of Waverly Woods. He was a grumpy old man, always muttering about kids these days and how no one had any respect anymore. But he was offering good money, and Jake and I were too broke to be picky. The job was simple enough. Clear out a few acres of brush and small trees so Mr. Harris could start building a new cabin. The problem was the land he wanted us to clear was deep in Waverly Woods. Jake was all for it. He didn't believe in the curse any more than I did, but something about the job made me uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I had a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. Still, the money was too good to pass up, so we took the job. The first day went by without incident. We worked from dawn till dusk, hacking away at the brush and chopping down small trees, the sound of our axes echoing through the woods. The sun was blazing down, and the air was thick with the smell of pine and sweat. By the time we called it a day, my arms felt like they were going to fall off, and my shirt was soaked through with sweat. But we'd made good progress, and Jake was already talking about how we should use the money to take a road trip before college started. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark, tangled trees of Waverly Woods, the shadows stretching out like claws. I told myself it was just exhaustion, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next morning, we headed back to the woods, but things felt different. The air was heavier, the shadows darker, and the woods were eerily silent, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Even Jake, who was usually all jokes and laughter, seemed tense, his eyes darting around as we worked. Around midday, we decided to take a break. We sat down on a fallen log, drinking water and catching our breath. That's when we heard a low, rumbling growl coming from deep within the woods. We both froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. "What the hell was that?" Jake whispered. I shook my head, my heart pounding in my chest. The growl came again, louder this time, closer. It sounded like no animal I'd ever heard before, a deep guttural sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "We should get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. But Jake just shook his head, a stubborn look on his face. "We're almost done," he said. "Let's just finish up and get out of here." I wanted to argue, but I didn't. We went back to work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing, and that growlet kept coming, always just out of sight, always getting closer. By the time the sun started to set, I was on edge, jumping at every little sound. Jake was trying to keep up a brave face, but I could tell he was scared, too. We decided to call it a day, planning to come back in the morning and finish up. But as we were packing up our tools, the growl came again, louder and more menacing than before. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something moving in the trees, a dark, shadowy figure, tall and thin, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. I grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him toward the truck. "We need to go now," I shouted, my voice filled with panic. Jake didn't argue this time. We threw our tools in the back of the truck and jumped in, speeding down the dirt road as fast as we could. The whole way back, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that shadowy figure chasing after us. But it never came. We didn't go back to Waverly Woods the next day. I called Mr. Harris and told him we were done, that he could keep the money, but we weren't going back. He didn't say much, just grumbled something under his breath and hung up. Jake and I didn't talk about what we saw, but I knew he was just as freaked out as I was. A few weeks later, we heard that Mr. Harris had gone missing. The police searched the woods, but they never found a trace of him, just his truck, parked on the side of the road near where we'd been working. People said he probably got lost in the woods, maybe fell into one of the old mine shafts that dotted the area, but Jake and I knew better. We knew what was really out there, lurking in the shadows of Waverly Woods. I went off to college that fall, and Jake and I drifted apart. But I've never forgotten what happened that summer, never forgotten the look in those glowing eyes. I haven't been back to my hometown in years, and I have no intention of ever going back. Waverly Woods still haunts my dreams, a place of darkness and fear that I can't escape. And every now and then, when I'm lying in bed, I hear that growl again, deep and menacing, reminding me that some secrets are better left buried. It was a late summer evening, the kind where the sun takes its time sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and purple. I'd just finished a long shift at the diner and was looking forward to getting home, kicking off my shoes, and finally relaxing. But as fate would have it, that night was going to be anything but relaxing. My route home took me down a series of back roads, winding through dense patches of forest and past empty fields that seemed to stretch on forever. It was the quickest way to get home, and on most nights I preferred it to the highway. It was peaceful, and I enjoyed the solitude, the way the trees would close in around the road, making me feel like I was driving through a tunnel of leaves. But that night, as the light faded and the shadows grew longer, the road didn't feel so inviting. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, and unease settling in my stomach that I couldn't shake. I turned up the radio, trying to drown out the creeping anxiety, but the music did little to soothe my nerves. I was about halfway home when I saw it. At first I thought it was a deer, just another animal caught in the headlights, frozen in the middle of the road. But as I got closer, I realized this was no deer. It was bigger, much bigger, and, standing on two legs, I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing as the car skidded to a stop. The creature didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me with glowing yellow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to put the car in reverse, desperate to get away from whatever this thing was. But as I started to back up, the creature moved. It took a step forward, then another, its movements smooth and deliberate, almost human. But this thing wasn't human. It was covered in dark, matted fur, its body hunched over like an animal, but its face was something out of a nightmare. It was a twisted mix of man and beast, with a long snout, sharp fangs, and those eyes, those glowing eyes that never left mine. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stare as the creature continued to approach, its claws clicking on the pavement with each step. It was getting closer to close. I threw the car into drive and floored it, the tires squealing as the car shot forward, swerving around the creature and speeding down the road. I glanced in the rearview mirror, hoping, praying that it was gone, but it wasn't. It was running after me, its long limbs eating up the distance between us faster than any animal should be able to move. My heart was pounding in my chest as I pushed the car to its limits, the engine roaring as I raced down the winding road. But no matter how fast I went, the creature kept up. It was right behind me, close enough that I could see its breath fogging up the back window. I could hear its claws scraping against the metal of the car, feel the whole vehicle shake as it lunged at me, trying to force its way inside. I swerved, trying to throw it off, but the creature held on, its claws digging into the roof of the car. I could hear the metal creaking, see the dents forming as it tried to rip its way through. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do, how to get away from this thing, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I didn't see it jump off, didn't hear it hit the ground. One moment it was there, and the next, it wasn't. The car lurched forward as the weight on the roof disappeared, and I nearly lost control, the tires skidding on the gravel as I tried to correct the steering. I didn't stop to look back. I just kept driving, my foot pressed to the floor, the car hurtling down the road at a speed that should have been impossible. I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away from that thing as I could. I don't know how long I drove like that, but by the time I finally slowed down, I was miles away, deep in the heart of the forest. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands still shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I was gasping for breath, my mind reeling from what I had just seen. I didn't dare get out of the car. I just sat there, staring out into the darkness, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. But there was nothing, just the sound of the wind and the trees, and the distant call of an owl. Eventually, I mustered the courage to start the car again, my hands still trembling as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I pulled back onto the road, driving at a much slower pace this time, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of the creature. I didn't see it again that night, but I could feel it watching me, could sense its presence in the darkness just beyond the reach of the headlights. I drove the rest of the way home in a daze, my mind numb with fear. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I didn't get out of the car right away. I just sat there staring at the front door, trying to convince myself that it was safe to go inside. But even as I stepped out of the car and walked up to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, staring out into the darkness, listening for any sound, any sign that the creature had followed me home. But the night passed without incident, and when the sun finally rose, I almost convinced myself that it had all been a bad dream. But it wasn't a dream. The claw marks on the roof of my car were proof of that. They were deep, long gouges that had torn through the metal like it was paper. I couldn't explain them, couldn't rationalize what had happened. All I knew was that I had come face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something that defied all logic and reason. I never took that road again. In fact, I went out of my way to avoid it, even if it meant adding hours to my commute. The memory of that night stayed with me, haunting me in the quiet moments when the world was still and my mind had time to wonder. I don't know what that creature was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that it's out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting for its next victim. And if you ever find yourself on those back roads at night, you'd better pray that it's not you. I'd been driving a taxi in the city for over 10 years, and in that time I'd seen it all: drunk passengers, rowdy teenagers, and even the occasional celebrity trying to avoid the paparazzi. But nothing could have prepared me for the night I picked up the hitchhiker. It was a cold December evening, and the snow had started to fall lightly, dusting the city in a layer of white. The streets were quieter than usual, with most people choosing to stay indoors by a warm fire rather than venture out in the cold. I'd been circling the downtown area, hoping to pick up one last fare before calling it a night. That's when I saw her, standing on the corner of 5th and Main, right next to the old, abandoned hotel. She was a young woman, maybe in her mid-20s, wearing a long, dark coat and a red scarf that stood out against the snow. She was waving at me, her face partially hidden by the shadows. I almost didn't stop. That part of town had a reputation, drug dealers, gang members, the kind of people you didn't want to mess with. But something about the way she looked at me, her eyes pleading, made me pull over. She got in the back, and the cold air followed her into the cab. "Thanks," she said, her voice soft and a little shaky. "I've been waiting out here for hours," I nodded, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. She looked pale, her skin almost as white as the snow outside. "Where to?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. She hesitated for a moment, then said, "Just drive. I'll tell you when to stop." That should have been my first red flag, but I didn't think much of it at the time. People in the city often gave vague directions, especially if they didn't want to reveal where they were really going. I pulled away from the curb, heading down Main Street. The snow was coming down harder now, the street lights casting eerie shadows on the road. The woman didn't say much, just stared out the window as we drove. After a few minutes, I tried to make small talk. "So you live around here?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, I'm just passing through, visiting family." She didn't answer right away, and I noticed her hands were trembling, clutching her scarf tightly around her neck. "No," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have any family." Something about the way she said it sent a chill down my spine. I glanced in the mirror again, and for a moment it looked like she wasn't even there, just an empty seat in the back of the cab. I blinked and she was back, her pale face reflecting in the glass. I felt a cold sweat start to form on my brow. "You okay?" I asked, trying to keep the unease out of my voice. She nodded, but her expression was distant, almost haunted. "Just keep driving," she said. "I'll tell you when to stop." We drove in silence for a while, the city lights fading as we headed toward the outskirts of town. The snow was coming down in thick, heavy flakes now, and the road was getting slippery. I was just about to suggest turning back when she suddenly spoke. "Turn left here," she said, pointing to a narrow, snow-covered road that I hadn't even noticed. I hesitated. The road looked barely passable, but something in her voice made me obey. I turned onto the road, the tires crunching over the snow. The street lights were few and far between, casting long, dark shadows on the road ahead. The further we drove, the darker it got, until the only light came from my headlights cutting through the snowstorm. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, trying to hide the nervousness in my voice. She didn't respond, just stared straight ahead, her eyes wide and unblinking. I was starting to feel genuinely scared now, a deep, knowing fear that I couldn't shake. The road twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the darkness. I didn't know where we were anymore, and the GPS had stopped working, the screen flashing no signal. "I think we should turn back," I said, my voice trembling. She finally looked at me, and the look in her eyes made my blood run cold. "It's too late to turn back," she said, her voice hollow. "Just keep going." I didn't argue. Something about her tone told me that turning back wasn't an option. We drove on, the snowstorm growing more intense, the road narrowing until it was barely wide enough for the cab. I felt like we were driving into another world, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the snowstorm stopped. The road ended in front of a large, crumbling mansion, its windows dark and empty. I hadn't seen it until we were right on top of it, the headlights illuminating its decaying facade. "Stop here," she said, her voice eerily calm. I did as she asked, pulling up in front of the mansion. The engine idled for a moment before I turned it off, the silence of the night pressing in on me. "Is this where you live?" I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. She didn't answer, just opened the door and stepped out into the snow. I watched as she walked toward the mansion, her figure barely visible in the darkness. "Wait," I called after her. "You didn't pay?" She stopped and turned to face me, and for the first time I saw her clearly. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and sunken. She looked like she hadn't eaten or slept in days, maybe weeks. "I don't need to pay," she said, her voice echoing in the stillness. "This is where I belong." With that, she turned and walked through the front door of the mansion, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there for a moment, my heart racing, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to go after her, to make sure she was okay. But the other part of me, the part that was paralyzed with fear, told me to leave, to get as far away from that place as possible. I chose the latter. I threw the car into reverse and backed out of there as fast as I could, the tires slipping on the icy road. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The mansion was gone. The road behind me was empty, just a snow-covered path leading back to the city. I drove back to the city in a daze, my mind racing. What had just happened? Had I imagined the whole thing? By the time I reached downtown, the snow had stopped, and the streets were deserted. I pulled into the taxi stand, my hand still shaking as I turned off the engine. I didn't tell anyone what happened that night. I wasn't sure they'd believe me if I did, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd encounter something otherworldly, something that didn't belong in this world. I avoided that part of town after that, never driving near the old, abandoned hotel again. And every time it snowed, I couldn't help but think of that hitchhiker standing on the corner, waiting for someone to take her home. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just me and a few buddies from college heading out into the wilderness to escape the hustle of the city. We had chosen a remote spot deep in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, far from the usual camping sites, because we wanted to experience nature in its rawest form. None of us were exactly seasoned outdoorsmen, but we figured a couple of days away from civilization would be good for us. We were wrong. The trip started off well enough. We loaded up the truck with all the essential tents, sleeping bags, enough food and beer to last us the weekend and set off early Saturday morning. The drive took us through winding mountain roads, past towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. By the time we reached the trailhead, it was late afternoon. The air was cool and crisp, with that earthy smell of pine needles and damp soil that you only find in deep forests. We hiked for a few hours, making our way further into the wilderness until we found a clearing by a small river, the perfect spot to set up camp. We pitched our tents, gathered some firewood, and settled in for the night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we sat around the fire, talking and laughing, the sound of the river providing a soothing background noise. The night was peaceful, the sky clear and filled with stars. But as the fire died down and the cold night air set in, I began to feel a sense of unease. It was subtle at first, just a nagging feeling in the back of my mind that something wasn't quite right. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming during the day, now felt different, almost hostile. The trees, which had towered protectively over us, now loomed ominously, their branches casting long, twisted shadows in the moonlight. The sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves and distant hoots of owls, seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if the forest itself was alive and watching us. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as the night wore on, the feeling grew stronger. I wasn't the only one who noticed it. You guys feel that? Mark, one of my friends, asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We all nodded, our eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Yeah, said Tom, another one of our group. It feels like we're being watched. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were all scared. We tried to laugh it off, telling ghost stories to lighten the mood, but even those felt too close to reality for comfort. Eventually, we decided to call it a night, each of us retreating to our tents, hoping that sleep would chase away the fear. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my tent, staring up at the fabric above me, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every rustle, every crack of a twig made my heart race. I could hear the others shifting restlessly in their tents, none of us able to relax. I don't know how long I lay there, but at some point I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of something moving outside. It was subtle at first, a soft crunching sound like something walking on the forest floor. I held my breath, listening. The sound grew louder, closer, as if whatever it was circling our camp. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I wanted to wake the others, but I was too scared to move, afraid that whatever was out there would hear me. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The forest was silent, the only sound the river flowing nearby. I waited, my muscles tense, but the noise didn't return. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and eventually I managed to fall back asleep. The next morning I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of birds chirping. The fear from the night before felt like a bad dream, something that didn't belong in the light of day. We didn't talk about it as we packed up our gear, each of us pretending that nothing had happened. We were supposed to be tough, after all, just a bunch of guys out in the woods. But as we started hiking back to the truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The trail, which had seemed so inviting the day before, now felt oppressive, the trees closing in on us, the path winding through dense underbrush. It wasn't long before we noticed the tracks. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before, huge footprints, easily twice the size of a man's foot, pressed deep into the soft soil. The prints were spaced far apart, too far for any human to have made them. We all stopped, staring at the tracks in stunned silence. What the hell is that? Mark finally said, his voice shaky. No one had an answer. The tracks led off the trail, disappearing into the thick underbrush. Whatever had made them was bigger than any animal I knew of in these woods. A sense of dread settled over us as we realized that whatever it was, it had been close to our camp the night before. We debated what to do. Part of me wanted to follow the tracks, to see where they led, but the rational part of my brain told me that was a terrible idea. In the end, we decided to keep moving, sticking to the trail and getting out of the woods as quickly as possible. But the sense of being watched only grew stronger. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made us jumpy. We walked faster, our eyes darting around, searching the shadows for any sign of movement. Then we heard a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around us. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard before, deep and menacing, reverberating through the trees. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. Run, Tom shouted, and we took off, sprinting down the trail as fast as we could. The growl followed us, growing louder, closer, as if whatever was making it was right behind us. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like they would give out, but we didn't stop. The truck was still a good mile away, and I wasn't sure we were going to make it. The growl was so close now that I could feel it vibrating in my chest. It was right behind me. I was sure of it. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the growl stopped. The forest fell silent again. The only sound our ragged breathing as we slowed to a walk, too exhausted to run any more. We didn't say a word, just kept moving, our eyes wide with fear, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. We finally reached the truck, and I've never been so relieved in my life. We threw our gear in the back and piled in, slamming the doors shut behind us. Mark started the engine, and we sped off, not looking back. None of us spoke on the drive back, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't until we were safely back in the city, the familiar sights and sounds of civilization around us, that we finally started to relax. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us out of those woods, something that didn't belong in our world. I haven't been back to the woods since that day, and I don't plan to. Some things are better left alone, and whatever we encountered in those deep, dark woods is one of them. I never expected to end up in a situation like this. My life had always been so ordinary: work, friends, a small but cozy apartment in the city. I didn't believe in ghosts or any of that paranormal nonsense. That was until I had an encounter that shattered my skepticism into a million pieces. It all started when I found a new place to live. My old apartment was being converted into condos, and the landlord had given me 2 months' notice to move out. One found the listing for this place online, an old house divided into several units. The price was right, the neighborhood was quiet, and it had a certain charm about it. The hardwood floors, the tall windows, the high ceilings, it all reminded me of a different era. The landlord was an older woman, sweet and talkative. She lived on the first floor and was always around, tending to the garden or sweeping the front steps. She seemed genuinely happy to have me as a tenant. Even gave me a warm loaf of bread the day I moved in. I didn't think much of it at the time, just figured she was the kind of person who liked to take care of others. The first night in my new place was uneventful. I unpacked, set up my furniture, and collapsed into bed, exhausted from the move. But it wasn't long before I realized that something was off. I woke up around 3 a.m. The room was pitch black, the kind of darkness where you can't even see your hand in front of your face. I reached over to the bedside lamp, but before I could turn it on, I heard a sound. It was faint at first, just a soft rustling, like someone moving through the room. I froze, my hand hovering over the lamp switch. I listened, straining to hear where the noise was coming from. It seemed to be right next to me, but there was nothing there. I told myself it was just the house settling, an old building making noise in the night. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It was a shuffling noise, as if someone was dragging their feet across the wooden floor. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to get up, to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence was deafening, more terrifying than the sound itself. I lay there, too scared to even breathe, waiting for something, anything to happen, but nothing did. Eventually, I managed to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. The next morning, I woke up feeling foolish. Daylight had a way of making the night's fears seem ridiculous, and I laughed it off, chalking it up to first night jitters in a new place. But the next night it happened again, and the night after that. Every time I woke up, it was always around 3 a.m., always in total darkness, and always to that same shuffling noise. It was as if someone was pacing back and forth in my room, just out of sight. I started losing sleep, dreading the nights. I tried everything, leaving the lights on, playing music, even sleeping with the TV on, but nothing worked. The nose would come, and with it, a growing sense of dread that something was terribly wrong. One night, after a particularly rough day at work, I decided to confront whatever was causing the disturbance. I was done being scared, done with sleepless nights. I stayed up late, determined to catch whatever it was in the act. I sat in bed, the covers pulled up to my chin, my eyes fixed on the door. At exactly 3 a.m., it started, the shuffling, the dragging of feet across the floor. But this time I was ready. I flicked on the light, expecting to see. Well, I didn't know what I expected to see, but the room was empty. There was nothing there, no sign of anyone or anything that could have made the noise, but the sound didn't stop. It was still there, still moving, even though I could see that the room was empty. My heart was in my throat as I listened to it move around the room, circling the bed, coming closer and closer, and then it stopped. Right at the foot of my bed, I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The air was thick with something I couldn't see, but I could feel it heavy, oppressive, like a weight pressing down on me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I just sat there, staring at the empty space in front of me, knowing that something was there, even though I couldn't see it. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in fear. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Eventually, the feeling lifted, and the room felt normal again. But I knew that whatever it was, it hadn't left. It was still there, somewhere in the house, watching me. I couldn't stay there anymore. The next day, I called in sick to work and started packing. I didn't care where I went, as long as it was far away from that place. As I was loading the last of my things into the car, the landlord came out to see me off. "You're leaving already?" she asked, a concerned look on her face. I didn't want to tell her the truth, didn't want her to think I was crazy, but something in her expression made me pause. It was like she knew, like she had been expecting this. "You've seen him, haven't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. My heart skipped a beat. "Seen who?" She sighed, her shoulders slumping as if a great weight had been lifted off them. "He's been here a long time, longer than me, longer than anyone. He doesn't mean any harm, but he's not someone you want to share a home with." I stared at her, my mind reeling. "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked at me with sad eyes. "Would you have believed me if I had?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I just got in the car and drove away, leaving the house and whatever haunted it behind. But the memory of those nights stayed with me, haunting me long after I left. I still think about it sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and the darkness feels to close. I wonder if he's still there, pacing those old floors, waiting for the next unlucky soul to move in, and I pray that I never have to face him again. I've been a taxi driver in New York City for over 15 years, and I've seen a lot of strange things in that time. You'd think that after all those years on the job, nothing would surprise me anymore. But I had an experience a few months ago that still gives me chills when I think about it. It was a typical Friday night just past midnight. The city was alive with the usual weekend crowd, people coming out of bars, couples heading home after a night out, and the occasional lost tourist trying to make sense of the subway system. I was cruising down 42nd Street when I saw her, a young woman standing on the corner, waving me down. She looked like she was in her mid-20s, dressed in a simple black dress, her long dark hair falling over her shoulders. There was something about her that seemed out of place, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it at the time. I pulled over, and she got in the back seat. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment I felt a chill run down my spine. They were the coldest eyes I had ever seen, almost devoid of any emotion. "Take me to Riverside Park," she said, her voice soft but clear. Something about her request struck me as odd. Riverside Park wasn't exactly a place you'd want to go to in the middle of the night, especially for a young woman alone. But it wasn't my place to question her, so I nodded and started driving. As we made our way through the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The streets, usually bustling even at this hour, seemed unusually quiet. The traffic lights seemed to change in slow motion, the city around us almost surreal. I glanced in the rearview mirror again. The woman was staring out the window, her expression unreadable. "You sure you want to go to Riverside Park?" I asked, trying to break the uneasy silence. She didn't respond right away, just kept staring out the window. Then, finally, she spoke. "Yes, I need to go there." There was a finality in her tone that made me drop the subject. The rest of the ride was silent. I couldn't help but feel like we were heading toward something I didn't want to be a part of. As we got closer to the park, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The streets around us became darker, the buildings older, as if we were driving back in time. By the time we reached Riverside Park, the air in the cab felt heavy, almost oppressive. I pulled up to the curb, and the woman leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine in the mirror. "Wait here," she said, handing me a $20 bill. "I won't be long." I watched as she got out of the cab and walked toward the park, disappearing into the shadows. I don't know why I waited. Something inside me told me I should just drive away, leave her there and forget about the whole thing. But I couldn't move. I just sat there, staring into the darkness where she had vanished. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The longer I sat there, the more the unease grew, turning into outright fear. I kept telling myself that I should leave, but something held me there, as if I was rooted to the spot. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the park, just outside the glow of the street lights, her figure barely visible in the shadows. For a moment I thought she was coming back to the cab, but then I realized she wasn't moving. She was just standing there, staring at me. I can't explain why, but the sight of her just standing there, motionless, filled me with a sense of dread unlike anything I'd ever felt before. It was as if she wasn't a person at all, but something else, something that didn't belong in this world. I finally managed to break free of whatever was holding me there. I slammed the car into gear and sped away from the park, my heart racing. I didn't look back until I was several blocks away, and when I did, she was gone. The spot where she had been standing was empty, as if she had never been there at all. I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind, chalking it up to fatigue or maybe just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the next day, I found something in the back seat of my cab that sent a shiver down my spine. It was a small, old-fashioned locket, the kind that you'd see in a Victorian-era portrait. I had never seen it before, and there was no way it could have been left there by anyone else. I opened it up, and inside was a tiny black and white photo of the woman who had been in my cab the night before. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to throw the locket away, but something told me that wouldn't be the end of it. I tried to return it to the park, hoping that maybe it would somehow put an end to the strange events. But when I got there, the park was different. It was the same place, but it didn't feel the same. The area where I had dropped the woman off seemed older, the trees gnarled and twisted, the path worn and cracked as if it hadn't been used in years. I left the locket on a bench near where I had seen her standing and hurried back to my cab. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, but I avoided Riverside Park after that. The locket was gone when I checked back a week later, and I haven't seen the woman since. But sometimes, late at night when I am driving through the city, I catch a glimpse of someone standing in the shadows, watching, and every time I get the same feeling of dread, as if she's still out there, waiting for something. Maybe she's waiting for another ride. I never thought much about what went on in factories after dark. To me, they were just places where things were made, where people worked long hours to keep the world running. I was about to learn how wrong I was. The job came to me through a friend who knew I was desperate for work. The factory wasn't exactly my first choice. I'd heard rumors about it being haunted, but I didn't believe in that sort of thing. The pay was good, and I needed the money, so I signed up for the night shift. My first day, or rather, night on the job, I arrived at the factory just before the sun dipped below the horizon. The building was old, with faded bricks and tall, narrow windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in decades. The inside wasn't much better. Dim lighting, the constant hum of machinery, and the smell of oil and metal that seemed to seep into everything. The night supervisor, a gruff man named Mr. Williams, gave me a quick tour. He didn't say much, just pointed out where I'd be working and told me to stay out of certain areas after dark. I thought he was just trying to mess with the new guy, but his serious expression made me wonder. The first few hours were uneventful. I was stationed in the packing area, loading boxes onto pallets. It was tedious work, but the rhythmic motion of lifting and stacking helped pass the time. The other workers kept to themselves, not even bothering to make small talk. As the night dragged on, I started to notice strange things. At first, it was just little stuffed tools that I knew I had set down somewhere would suddenly be gone, only to turn up in a completely different part of the factory. Or the machines would stop working for no reason, only to start up again when I wasn't looking. I told myself it was just the fatigue playing tricks on me. After all, the night shift was new to me, and I wasn't used to the hours. But then, around 2 a.m., things took a turn for the worse. I was in the break room, grabbing a quick bite to eat when I heard a noise coming from the main floor. It sounded like metal scraping against metal, followed by a loud bang. I jumped up, thinking maybe one of the machines had broken down, and rushed out to see what was going on. But when I got there, everything was quiet. The machines were still running, the assembly line still moving, but there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. I was about to head back to the break room when I saw something out of the corner of my eye, shadow darting between the machines. I turned to get a better look. When it was gone, my heart started to race. I wasn't sure what I had seen, but it didn't feel right. I tried to shake it off, went back to work, but I couldn't get that image out of my head as the night wore on. Things got stranger. The lights would flicker on and off, plunging the factory into darkness for seconds at a time. And every time the lights came back on, it felt like the shadows had moved, like something was creeping closer, just out of sight. Then there were the voices. At first I thought it was just the wind, or maybe the hum of the machines. But as I listened more closely, I realized it was something else entirely. Faint whispers, like a conversation happening just beyond my hearing. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, desperate, like someone trapped, trying to get out. I tried to ignore it, to focus on my work, but it was impossible. The factory felt like it was closing in on me, like the walls were alive, breathing. I wasn't the only one who noticed. The other workers started to get jittery too, glancing around nervously, jumping at every little nose. But no one said anything. It was like an unspoken rule, don't acknowledge it, and maybe it'll go away. But it didn't. By the time my shift was almost over, I was on edge, my nerves shot. I was counting down the minutes until I could get out there when it happened. I was loading the last pallet onto the truck when I heard a loud crash, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The other workers were all frozen, staring at the same spot, their faces pale. And then, out of the darkness, something moved. It was hard to describe, more of a presence than a shape, like a shadow that didn't belong. It slid across the floor, moving toward us with a slow, deliberate pace. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, watching as it got closer and closer. Just when I thought it was going to reach us, the lights flickered one last time and went out completely. We were plunged into darkness, the kind where you can't see your hand in front of your face. The whispers started again, louder this time, like they were all around us. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the lights came back on. The shadow was gone, but the air was thick with something I couldn't explain. Fear, dread, something more than just the darkness. No one said a word. We all just stood there, staring at the spot where the shadow had been, trying to make sense of what we had just seen. Eventually, Mr. Williams came out of his office, his face pale and drawn. He didn't say anything, just motioned for us to finish up. We did as we were told, moving in a daze, the fear still clinging to us like a second skin. I left the factory that morning and never went back. I didn't need the job that badly, not after what I had experienced. I don't know what that place is, what it does to the people who work there, but I do know that I'm never going near it again. And I'll never forget the night I spent there, the night I learned that some places should be left alone. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe it was the thrill of doing something dangerous or the peer pressure from my friends. But whatever the reason, it was the biggest mistake of my life. It all started one summer night when my friends, Jake, Emily, and I were sitting around a campfire in Jake's backyard. We were talking about urban legends and ghost stories when Jake brought up the old asylum on the outskirts of town. The place had been abandoned for decades, and everyone in town knew about its dark history. It was said that the asylum had been shut down after several patients mysteriously disappeared, never to be seen again. There were rumors of cruel experiments and tortured souls that still roamed the halls. Of course, we'd all heard the stories before, but none of us really believed them. That's when Jake had the bright idea to visit the asylum that night. "Come on," he said, a mischievous grin on his face. "Let's check it out. It'll be fun." I wasn't thrilled with the idea, but Emily was all for it. She'd always had a fascination with the paranormal, and this was right up her alley. I tried to protest, but they were already getting up, ready to go. "It's just an old building," Jake said, brushing off my concerns. "What's the worst that could happen?" I reluctantly agreed, telling myself that it was just for one night and that nothing would come of it. We grabbed our flashlights, hopped in Jake's car, and made our way to the asylum. The drive there was quiet, with only the sound of the car engine and the occasional owl hooting in the distance. The road was narrow and winding, the trees on either side closing in like a dark tunnel. The closer we got, the more uneasy I felt, but I didn't say anything. When we finally arrived, the sight of the asylum sent a shiver down my spine. The building loomed in the darkness, its windows shattered, and its walls covered in ivy. The gate at the entrance was rusted and hanging off its hinges, creaking in the breeze. The whole place reeked of decay and abandonment. "This place is creepy as hell," Emily whispered, but there was excitement in her voice. Jake led the way as we made our way through the broken gate and up the overgrown path to the main entrance. The door was slightly ajar, and with a push, it creaked open, revealing a dark, musty interior. The air inside was heavy, filled with the scent of mildew and rot. We shone our flashlights around, revealing peeling paint, crumbling walls, and debris scattered across the floor. The atmosphere was oppressive, like the building itself was alive and watching us. "This is awesome," Jake said, his voice echoing through the empty halls. He was in his element, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't be there. We wandered through the asylum, our footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. The further we went, the more unsettling it became. The rooms were filled with old, rusted hospital beds, and the walls were covered in strange markings that looked like they'd been scratched in by hand. Emily stopped in front of one of the doors and shone her flashlight on a sign above it. "Ward 13, she read aloud. "This must be where they kept the worst of the patients. Let's check it out," Jake suggested, already reaching for the door handle. I wanted to say no, but I didn't want to be the one to chicken out. So I kept quiet as Jake pushed open the door. The room inside was even worse than the others. The walls were covered in graffiti, and the floor was littered with broken glass. But what caught my attention was the old operating table in the center of the room. It was rusted and stained with something dark and dry, and I could almost imagine the screams that must have echoed off the walls during whatever horrific procedures had taken place there. Emily, ever the explorer, started taking pictures while Jake poked around, looking for anything interesting. I just stood there, trying to keep my growing sense of dread under control. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I almost missed it. I froze, straining to hear it again. But the only sound was Jake and Emily's voices as they joked around. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but then I heard it again, louder this time. It was coming from the direction of the operating table. I shone my flashlight over it, my heart racing. There was nothing there, but the whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. It was like a chorus of voices, all overlapping and blending together, making it impossible to understand what they were saying. "Do you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Jake and Emily stopped what they were doing and looked at me. "Hear what?" Jake asked, his brow furrowed. "The whispering," I said, my voice barely above a whisper itself. They both listened for a moment, but then Jake shrugged. "I don't hear anything, man. You're probably just freaking yourself out." But Emily was frowning, her face pale. "I hear it," she said, her voice shaky. "It's coming from that table." Jake laughed nervously. "Come on, you're just imagining things. Let's keep moving." But Emily and I were both on edge now. We could hear the whispering, and it was getting louder. I wanted to leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I felt like if I moved, something terrible would happen. Then, out of nowhere, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the whispers. It was as if the whole building was holding its breath, waiting. And then we heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere deeper in the asylum. "We need to get out of here," Emily said, her voice barely audible. Jake nodded, his earlier bravado gone. We turned to leave, but the door we had come through was now closed. I knew we had left it open, but there it was, shut tight. Jake tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as we realized we were trapped. The footsteps were getting closer, echoing through the halls. They didn't sound like they were coming from a person, though. They were too slow, too deliberate, like something was taking its time, savoring every step. "There has to be another way out," Jake said, his voice shaking. He started looking for another exit, but the room only had one door. The footsteps were right outside the door now, and we could hear something dragging along the floor behind them. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of prank, or maybe just our imaginations running wild. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Whatever was out there wasn't human, and it was coming for us. The door handle started to turn, and Emily let out a terrified scream. We all backed away from the door, pressing ourselves against the far wall. The door creaked open, and for a moment there was nothing but darkness on the other side. And then we saw it, a figure, tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows. It was draped in tattered clothing that hung off its skeletal frame, and its eyes glowed with a faint, unnatural light. But the worst part was its mouth. It was twisted into a grotesque smile, wide and unnatural, stretching across its face in a way that no human mouth ever could. The figure stepped into the room, dragging something behind it that we couldn't see. The air grew colder, and the lights in our flashlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Emily was crying now, and Jake was frozen in place, his eyes wide with terror. The figure took another step toward us, its smile growing wider. I could feel the cold radiating off of it, seeping into my bones. I knew we had to get out of there, but I couldn't move. I was trapped in a nightmare, and there was no escape. Then, just as the figure was about to reach us, the door behind us flew open. We didn't waste a second. We bolted out of the room, not looking back. We ran down the hall, our footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. I could hear the figure behind us, its footsteps slow and deliberate, but somehow always keeping pace with us, no matter how fast we ran. We reached the front door, and, to our relief, it was still open. We burst out of the asylum, and into the cool night air, not stopping until we were safely in Jake's car, speeding away from that cursed place. None of us said a word on the drive back. We were too shaken, too terrified to speak. When we finally got back to Jake's house, we all swore never to talk about what had happened, but the nightmare didn't end there. For weeks after, I was plagued by horrible dreams of that figure, its twisted smile haunting me every time I closed my eyes. I started seeing it everywhere, in the shadows of my room, in the corner of my eye, even in my own reflection. Emily and Jake weren't much better. We all stopped hanging out after that night. We couldn't be around each other without being reminded of what we had seen. I don't know what that figure was or why it was in that asylum, but I do know that it wasn't human, and whatever it was, It was a Friday night, and, like many others, I had decided to make some extra cash by driving for Uber. The evening had been uneventful, just the usual pickups and drop-offs in the city. The streets were buzzing with the usual nightlife, people spilling out of bars and restaurants, laughing and shouting, oblivious to anything but their own good time. I had just dropped off my last passenger in a quiet residential neighborhood and was thinking about calling it a night when a new ride request popped up. It was a bit out of the way, but the fare was decent, and I figured one more ride wouldn't hurt. I accepted the request and followed the directions to the pickup location. The address led me to an older part of town, where the streets were narrow and the buildings loomed close together. There were no street lights, just the dim glow of porch lights and the occasional flicker from an old neon sign. As I approached the address, I noticed something odd. The house was dark, with no lights on at all. It didn't look like anyone was home, but I double-checked the app, and it confirmed that this was the place. I pulled up in front of the house and waited. After a few minutes, I was about to cancel the ride when I saw someone step out of the shadows. It was a man dressed in dark clothing, his face hidden by the hood of his jacket. He moved slowly, almost reluctantly, as if he wasn't sure he wanted to get into the car. I rolled down the window and asked if he was the one who had requested the ride. He nodded without saying a word and got into the back seat. The moment he closed the door, I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something about him that set me on edge, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, but his face was still obscured by the hood. His silence was unnerving, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just having a bad night. I put the car in gear and started driving, following the GPS directions to his destination. As we drove, I couldn't help but notice the strange vibe in the car. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. The man hadn't said a word since he got in, and the silence was starting to feel oppressive. I tried to make small talk, asking him how his night was going, but he didn't respond. Instead, he just stared straight ahead, his hands resting on his lap. I could see his fingers twitching slightly, like he was nervous or agitated. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I kept driving, hoping that we'd reach his destination soon, so I could drop him off and be done with it. We were heading out of the city now, into a more rural area where the roads were winding and dark. The houses became fewer and farther between, and soon there was nothing but open fields on either side of the road. I glanced at the GPS again, but it wasn't showing any clear destination, just a series of turns that seemed to lead deeper into the countryside. The farther we went, the more uneasy I became. I wanted to ask the man where we were going, but something told me not to. The tension in the car was thick, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, the GPS instructed me to take a left turn onto a narrow dirt road. The road was barely visible in the darkness, just a thin strip of gravel cutting through the tall grass. I hesitated, but the man in the back seat shifted slightly, as if urging me to keep going. I took a deep breath and made the turn. The car jolted as it left the pavement, the tires crunching over the gravel. The dirt road was rough, full of potholes and ruts that made the car shake and rattle. I could barely see where I was going, the headlights illuminating only a small patch of road ahead. After what felt like an eternity, the road suddenly came to an end in front of an old, decrepit building. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, the windows boarded up, the walls covered in graffiti. There was no sign of life, no lights, no movement, nothing. I stopped the car and turned to the man, but he was already opening the door, stepping out into the darkness. He still hadn't said a word, and as he walked away, he disappeared into the shadows, swallowed up by the night. I sat there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The whole situation had been bizarre, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I considered waiting for him to return, but something told me to leave. I put the car in reverse and backed out onto the dirt road, eager to get away from that place. As I drove back towards the main road, I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that man, and why had he wanted to go to such a remote, abandoned place? The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. When I finally reached the main road, I breathed a sigh of relief, but my relief was short-lived. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my blood ran cold. There, in the back seat, was the man sitting exactly where he had been before. His hood was still up, hiding his face, but I could see his hands resting on his lap, just like before. My heart skipped a beat. I had seen him get out of the car. There was no way he could be back in it. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking as I turned around to confront him. But when I looked into the back seat, it was empty. There was no one there. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the back seat was completely empty. I turned back to the road, my mind racing. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I just exhausted from the long night? I didn't know what to think. All I knew was that I needed to get home, and fast. I drove the rest of the way back to the city in a daze, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over. By the time I got home, the sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale light over the city. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread. As I got out of the car and walked up to my apartment, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man standing there, watching me. But there was nothing, just the empty street, and the faint sound of birds chirping in the distance. I went inside, locked the door behind me, and collapsed onto the couch. I didn't sleep that day or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man in the back seat, his hooded figure looming in the darkness. I quit driving for Uber after that. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home that night, something that I couldn't explain. And every now and then, when I'm out driving late at night, I catch a glimpse of a figure in the rearview mirror, sitting silently in the back seat, waiting. I never thought my job would take such a dark turn. I'm a property manager in a small town, and most of my days are filled with the usual tasks: showing apartments, handling maintenance requests, and managing leases. It's a straightforward job, nothing too exciting. That was until I was assigned Blackwood Manor, an old, sprawling estate on the edge of town. The manor had been empty for years, but it was finally time to find new tenants. I was tasked with preparing the place for new occupants. The moment I stepped inside Blackwood Manor, I felt an unsettling chill. The house was massive, with high ceilings, grand staircases, and long corridors. The decor was a mix of old-world charm and faded grandeur. It was clear that the manor had once been magnificent, but years of neglect had taken their toll. Despite the dust and cobwebs, I could see the potential for this place to be something special again. I started with the basics: cleaning, fixing broken windows, and repairing the old plumbing. But as I worked, strange things began to happen. At first, it was little things: a door creaking open by itself, footsteps echoing in empty rooms, and lights flickering on and off. I told myself it was just the old wiring and the settling of the house, but then things started to escalate. One evening, while I was working late, I heard a loud bang from the upstairs hallway. I went to investigate, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The door to one of the bedrooms was slightly ajar, and as I approached, I felt a cold breeze wash over me. I stepped inside and saw that the room was in perfect order, no sign of any disturbance. I shrugged it off and went back to my work. The next day, I noticed that furniture I had moved the day before was back in its original place. I had been alone in the house, so I knew no one else had been there. It was as if the house was rearranging itself. I started to hear whispers, soft and unintelligible, coming from different parts of the manor. It felt like I was being watched, though I never saw anyone. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the more time I spent in the manor, the more the disturbances grew. One night as I was leaving the house, I noticed something strange. The windows on the second floor were illuminated by a soft, flickering light. I knew that the electricity was off, so there was no reason for any lights to be on. I decided to check it out. When I got inside, the light had vanished. I made my way up to the second floor, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The light was coming from a room at the end of the corridor. I approached cautiously, and when I opened the door, I was met with an unexpected sight. The room was filled with old furniture, covered in white sheets. But what caught my attention were the figures in the sheets. They looked like they were moving, shifting and swirling as if they were alive. I stepped back, my heart racing, and slammed the door shut. I decided it was time to leave. As I was heading down the stairs, I heard a voice clear and distinct calling my name. I froze, my blood running cold. The voice was feminine, soft, and soothing, but there was something unsettling about it. "Come here," it said. I turned around, but saw nothing. The voice continued to call out, growing more insistent. I ran out of the manor, slamming the door behind me. I didn't return that night. Over the next few weeks, I did some research into the history of Blackwood Manor. I found out that the house had once belonged to the Blackwood family, who were well known in the town for their wealth and influence. But their story was not as glamorous as it seemed. The Blackwoods had been known for their cruelty and eccentricity. Rumors circulated about their mistreatment of servants and strange, occult practices. The manor had a reputation for being haunted, but no one had ever been able to confirm the stories. Despite the rumors, I knew I had to finish my job. I had already invested too much time and effort into the project, so I returned to the manor, determined to get the place ready for new tenants. The disturbances continued, but I tried to ignore them. The whispers grew louder, the voices more frequent. I would hear them even when I was outside the manor, as if they were following me. One evening, as I was working in the basement, I found an old journal hidden behind a loose brick in the wall. It belonged to one of the Blackwood family members, and it detailed their experiments and rituals. The journal spoke of summoning spirits and making pacts with otherworldly entities. It was clear that the Blackwoods had been involved in something dark and sinister. As I read the journal, I felt a chill. The final entry was a desperate plea for forgiveness and a warning to anyone who came after them. It mentioned that the spirits trapped in the manor were restless and vengeful, bound to the house by the rituals performed by the Blackwoods. I realized that the disturbances were not just coincidences. The manor was haunted by the spirits of those who had suffered at the hands of the Blackwoods. They were trapped, unable to move on, and their anger and sorrow were manifesting in the house. I decided to hold a seance, hoping to communicate with the spirits and help them find peace. I gathered some candles and a few friends who were interested in the paranormal. We performed the ritual as best as we could, following the instructions in the journal. During the seance, the air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder. We saw shadowy figures moving in the corners of our vision, and the candles flickered wildly. One of my friends, who claimed to have a gift for communicating with spirits, began speaking in a strange voice. She claimed to be channeling one of the spirits trapped in the manor. The spirit spoke of betrayal and pain, of promises broken and souls lost. It was clear that the Blackwoods had wronged many people, and their spirits were still bound to the manor, seeking retribution. After the séance, the disturbances in the manor grew more intense. The whispers turned into screams, and the figures we saw were more defined, more menacing. The atmosphere in the house was unbearable. I knew I had to get out. I finished my work as quickly as possible, and within a few days I had the manor ready for new tenants. I made sure to warn them about the strange occurrences, but I don't know if they believed me. As I left Blackwood Manor, for the last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, following me. The whispers continued for weeks, even after I left the town. They faded over time, but the memories of Blackwood Manor stayed with me. I never went back, and I don't think I ever will. Some places are better left alone, and Blackwood Manor is one of them. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when the usual sense of security in my small suburban home was shattered. I had just settled in for a peaceful night, curled up with a book in the living room. The day had been typical, nothing out of the ordinary. I felt safe, comfortable, completely unaware of the nightmare that was about to unfold. The first sign that something was wrong came as a barely audible creak from the direction of the kitchen. I paused, listening intently, but the house was otherwise silent. I brushed it off as the house settling or a neighbor's footsteps. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by a soft scraping noise. My heart began to race as I stood up and cautiously made my way toward the kitchen. The lights were off, and the only illumination came from the street lights filtering through the window blinds. I reached the kitchen and checked the back door, which was locked as it should be. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken glass. The scraping sound stopped, and the silence was almost deafening. I checked the rest of the house, flipping on lights and peering into every dark corner. Everything seemed to be in place. I was about to head back to the living room when I heard the sound again, this time coming from the basement. My gut twisted into knots. I rarely went into the basement only for storage, and rarely after dark. The basement door was down a small hallway, and as I approached it, I noticed that it was slightly ajar. I hadn't left it like that. A sense of dread washed over me, but I had to check. Maybe it was a raccoon or some other animal that had gotten in through the vents. I took a deep breath and slowly descended the stairs. The basement was cold and damp, filled with the smell of old, musty books and forgotten furniture. I flicked on the basement light, revealing boxes stacked haphazardly along the walls. The sound had stopped, and the basement was eerily still. I walked further into the room, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Suddenly, a loud bang came from the far corner of the basement. I jumped, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned to see a figure darting behind a stack of boxes. Panic surged through me. Someone was in my house. I raced back up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I dialed 911 with trembling hands, trying to explain the situation as calmly as I could. The dispatcher assured me that police were on their way, but it felt like an eternity. I locked myself in the bedroom and waited, my nerves on edge. Every little noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to shift and move. The minutes felt like hours. Finally, I heard the sirens outside. The police arrived and carefully swept through the house, checking every room, every corner. They found no sign of a break-in or any intruder. They checked the basement, too, but it was empty, just as I had left it. They reassured me that it was likely just an animal or prank, but their words did little to ease my fear. They left after a while, and I was left alone in the silence of my home. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I tried to go back to sleep, but every creak, every gust of wind felt like an intrusion. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't relax at home. I kept checking and rechecking the locks, the windows. I started noticing strange things, objects out of place, noises that seemed to come from nowhere. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the unease never fully went away. One night I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard the sound again. It was a soft, scraping noise, just like before. I froze, listening intently. The noise came from the basement. I didn't know what to do. I felt paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to call for help. I lay there in the dark, listening to the noise grow louder, closer. It felt like the basement was alive, like something was moving around down there, something that shouldn't be. Eventually the noise stopped, and the silence returned. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way to the basement. My heart was pounding in my chest as I opened the basement door and descended the stairs. The basement was dark, cold, and still. I shone the flashlight around, but there was nothing unusual, no intruders, no signs of anything out of the ordinary. Just the same old clutter, the same old shadows. I was about to head back up when I noticed something new, a faint, unsettling mark on the wall near the far corner. It looked like scratches, deep and uneven, as if something had tried to claw its way out. My blood ran cold. I quickly turned and fled up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I locked myself in the bedroom once more, my mind racing. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay there. The next morning, I packed up some essentials and stayed with a friend until I could figure out what to do. I contacted a security company and had them install a comprehensive security system in my home. I also hired a locksmith to reinforce the doors and windows, hoping to feel a little safer. The incidents stopped after that. There were no more strange noises, no more feelings of being watched. But the memory of that night, the feeling of fear and dread, stayed with me. Every time I hear a creak or a bump in the night, I think back to that night and wonder if something is still lurking in the shadows, waiting for another chance to make itself known. It was a classic cross-country road trip, a chance to hit the open road, escape the daily grind, and make some unforgettable memories. My best friend, Alex, and I had decided to drive along Route 66, soaking in the sights and the history of one of America's most iconic highways. We set out in the late afternoon, eager to cover as much ground as possible before nightfall. The sun was just beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink as we drove through the wide-open landscapes of the American Midwest. We were chatting, laughing, and listening to classic rock, the perfect soundtrack for our adventure. As the evening progressed, we found ourselves on a stretch of road that seemed to go on forever, flanked by fields of corn and the occasional dilapidated farmhouse. We hadn't seen another car for miles, and the silence was almost unnerving. That's when we saw her young woman standing by the side of the road, her thumb extended, hitchhiking. She looked out of place in the middle of nowhere. She was dressed in a vintage-style dress that looked like it was from the 1950s, with her long hair blowing gently in the breeze. Her appearance was striking, almost ethereal against the fading light. Alex slowed down as we approached her, and I leaned over to get a better look. She seemed to be about our age, maybe a little older. Her face was obscured by the setting sun, but there was something compelling about her. "Should we pick her up?" I asked, glancing at Alex. He looked at me, then back at the hitchhiker. "Why not? We're not in a hurry, and it's getting dark." "She might be stranded." Alex pulled over, and I rolled down the window. "Hey there, you need a ride?" The woman smiled warmly and nodded. "Thank you. I've been waiting for quite a while." She climbed into the back seat, and we continued on our way. I could feel a chill in the air as she got in, but I brushed it off as the evening temperature dropping. We introduced ourselves, and she told us her name was Sarah. Her voice was soft and melodic, and she had a calming presence. We chatted casually as we drove, learning that she was on her way to a small town not too far ahead. She said she had been visiting friends and was trying to get home. The conversation was pleasant, and we didn't think much of it until we reached a small town that Sarah said was her destination. It was a quaint little place with a few scattered lights and old-fashioned storefronts. Alex pulled over to the side of the road and turned to Sarah. "This is where you wanted to get off, right?" Sarah nodded, thanking us for the ride. "I really appreciate it. I was getting worried about being stranded out here." We watched as she stepped out of the car and walked toward a small house at the end of the street. As she reached the porch, she turned and gave us a final wave before disappearing inside. We waved back and drove away, continuing our journey. About an hour later, we stopped at a diner for a late-night snack. We were still talking about Sarah when a server came over with our food. "You guys traveling far?" she asked, glancing at us with a curious look. "Yeah, we're doing Route 66, Alex replied. "We picked up a hitchhiker a while back. She got off in that little town a bit ago." The server's expression changed to one of surprise and concern. "What town did you drop her off in?" she asked. We told her the name of the town, and the server's face grew pale. "That town is deserted. There hasn't been anyone living there for years. It's an old ghost town." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Are you sure?" She seemed real enough. The server nodded solemnly. "Oh, she's real all right. But she's been gone for decades. The vanishing hitchhiker. People say she's a ghost, appearing to travelers and then disappearing before they can even remember her face." Alex and I looked at each other, trying to process what we had just heard. "That's impossible," Alex said, shaking his head. She was so real. We talked to her, and she seemed completely normal. The server shrugged. "It's one of those stories that people tell along Route 66. You hear it from time to time. I guess you guys are the latest to experience it." We finished our meal in stunned silence, unable to shake the eerie feeling that had settled over us. The idea that we had picked up a ghost was unsettling. When we finally got back on the road, we tried to put it out of our minds, but the experience lingered. The rest of the trip was filled with a sense of unease, and we couldn't help but wonder if we'd ever encounter something like that again. The vanishing hitchhiker of Route 66 became a story we told many times, a chilling reminder of that strange evening. And every time I hear the tale of travelers encountering a mysterious hitchhiker, I can't help but think of Sarah, the ghostly figure who vanished without a trace.